All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on the turpentine industry in Sarasota County, the pines, the process, and the people. I am Dr. Catherine Clements. I'm the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator at our University of Florida IFAS Extension here in Sarasota County. In my position, I provide education for both youth and adults and assist our overall community with generally what I'm doing is wildlife education and answering questions about wildlife, and also doing wildlife presentations at HOAs. I also talk about native and invasive species. We have a part of our programming where we educate on the health benefits of spending time in nature. And we also do a variety of guided tours, which we call eco walks, at our county parks and preserves, where you can come out and just take a 2-hour walk with us at some of these wonderful locations. So the history of turpentining is a little bit of a side bar for me, but it was super fun to learn more about the history of turpentining and very eye-opening to learn about the turpentine industry here in Sarasota, Florida. So I hope you will enjoy learning about it as well. A little bit about my background on there. And then this is our extension office. If you haven't been to it before, it is east on Clark Road, just a bit east of the interstate. We have a classroom there where we provide a lot of our classes. We also have a plant clinic desk where you can come Monday through Thursday, I believe 10 to 3, and ask master gardeners questions about your landscaping. And then we also have wonderful and beautiful demonstration gardens around our building to enjoy. Our UFIFAS Extension offices are a partnership between Sarasota County or the local county we're in, the University of Florida, and the USDA. This is part of the land grant university mission. So all land grant universities throughout our country have extension offices, and we have an extension office in Florida associated with all 67 of our counties. And really our mission is to take the research and the resources from the university and be able to share those into our local communities as they are needed. So each extension office is a little bit different depending on the local county. Our extension office is quite a large office for the state, and we have programming in all of the areas that you see on the screen. So we have programs in agriculture, sustainability, gardening and horticulture, a lot of natural resources programming, some nutrition and a healthy living program, and of course, the University of Florida monitors or manages the youth development program called 4-H here in our state, which is a wonderful program to get the youth involved in. All right, so let's get started. We're going to go through the pines and the process and the people of the turpentining industry in that order. So we'll start out with the pines because this is where it all begins. The story of turpentining really begins with Florida's pine flatwoods. And for hundreds of years, the whole southeast coastal plain, which is basically the area you see outlined with all the states and counties there in the southeast coastal area, so along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico coast. And in the green area is the historic range of the longleaf pine species, Pinus palustris. So this used to be the majority of the ecosystems in the southeast coastal plain. About 90 million acres of this area was Florida pine flatwoods and longleaf pine ecosystems. It is considered one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth, meaning there's a huge variety of both animals and plants that exist in the longleaf pine ecosystem. It is home to nearly 600 plant and animal species, including 29 threatened and endangered species such as the red cockaded woodpecker, gopher tortoise, eastern indigo snake, frosted flatwood salamander, which only now exists in 2 tiny locations in this whole area, and gopher frogs, as well as many others. 97% of this ecosystem has been lost due to development, timbering, turpentining, and fire suppression activity that was more common in the early 1900s. Many of our pinelands have been replanted throughout this area, but they're usually replanted, especially here in our area of Florida, with a species called South Florida slash pine. In North Florida, often the historic pine, longleaf pine flatwoods are now pine plantations that are planted with loblolly pine. So although there are some pine flatwoods that have been replanted, often it's not with the longleaf pine species. We will talk a little bit more about longleaf pine restoration in our final slide today. And I just wanted to show you some pictures of how beautiful pine flatwoods are. The majority of these pictures are actually South Florida slash pine. This one I can't tell for sure. This one is up in Gainesville in the research forest at UF. So there very well could be a variety of longleaf pine here, as well as some South Florida slash pine. And you can just see that typically there's a pretty open canopy so sunlight can get to the ground. There isn't a lot of mid-story in our pine flatwood ecosystems. And then the ground cover usually is more herbaceous and consists of native grasses, some saw palmetto, and lots of herbaceous, beautiful wildflowers. Such as you see here, this is a picture recently from T. Mabry Carlton Reserve here in Sarasota County. I took this either in November or January, probably November, so not too long ago. And all of those purple flowers you see are a Liatris species, which is a species that is not only incredibly beautiful, but often comes up much better or germinates much better after a fire has been through the ecosystem. So I believe in this area, there was a fire here a year and a half before I took this picture. And this was the first year that they'd seen such an incredible bloom of Liatris throughout the area. Here's another picture from Carlton, which really highlights the beauty of the native grasses in the ground cover and undergrowth. Here's a picture from Shearer Thaxton Preserve, which is a county preserve in Sarasota County, right? It abuts Oscar Shearer State Park. It's a beautiful little preserve, and these are some of the pine flatwoods in that preserve. And the flower you're seeing, I believe this one is a Carphephorus species, often referred to as vanilla leaf. And then here are some of the other really beautiful wildflowers. The one on the left of your screen is Carphephorus punctatus. This is an unusual Carphephorus species. I found this in Mayaca, and it has a green lynx spider on it. Really fun photo to get an opportunity to take. I took this about 2 months ago as well. We have some helianthus or swamp sunflower up at the top that blooms. I'm not sure if this photo was either Mayaca River State Park or Carlton. It blooms in a number of our preserves here. Below that is pine lily, which is one of our listed species of plants. And these, I believe, only bloom for usually about 24 hours. And we do have some in some of our county preserves as well as our state park. And then there is that Liatris species on your right-hand side of the screen. And then some of the animal species, that is an oak toad, one of our native toads here in Sarasota County. And that one also, either Mayaca or Carlton there, that's in the hands of a Florida Master Naturalist student, might have even been Oscar Shearer State Park. And then the black snake below is a black racer taken at Oscar Shearer State Park. And then the white-tailed deer taken at Oscar Shearer as well. And then, of course, gopher tortoise on your right, which can be found in many of our county preserves and our state parks here in Sarasota County. So these are all just examples of the beauty and the biodiversity that we find in these pine flatwood ecosystems. Of course, our longleaf pine ecosystems being more diverse and offering more habitat for many of these plant and animal species. So let's talk a little bit about the history of how pine products became used economically in our country. So the naval stores industry developed along the east coast of our country, and it initially produced tar and pitch from burning of pine stumps, and that tar and pitch was used to seal the seams of wooden ships back in the 17, 18, and early 1900s. In the 1700s, demand was so great for this product that Britain offered a bounty which covered the high shipping costs of pine products back to Britain and made it more economical for them to be produced and sold over there. In 1768, 60% of imported naval stores to Britain came from North Carolina. So there were pine flatwoods throughout the East Coast, the longleaf pine being more specific to the southeastern coastal plain. And the naval industry, the naval stores industry, started in the Northeast, but as the pine plantations, or the not plantations at that point, but the pine forests were decimated, it sort of moved south over time. And North Carolina became a huge producer in the mid to late 1700s. And then we're going to see that finally, as all of those pine ecosystems were decimated, the naval stores industry moved into Florida more in the early 1900s. In the early 1800s, the process of distilling crude gum resin, which is what you get from the pine tree that you then make things like turpentine and rosin from, this process was improved. And first they started using cast iron stills instead of burning the pine stumps in a pit. Those cast iron stills, as you can imagine, were incredibly heavy and couldn't be made very big or transported over long distances. So then in the 1830s, copper stills were invented, allowing for greater portability and transport deeper into the woods. So this extended the ability of the turpentine industry to get farther into these pine flatwood ecosystems to actually extract the oleo resin from the pine trees. So in 1860, naval stores were one of the top exports from the southern states, third only to cotton and tobacco at this point in time. And in North Carolina, the industry was valued at $5.3 million a year, which at that point in time is a lot, and was responsible for over 95% of the U.S. naval stores production by 1860. Initially, slaves produced much of the labor, and when slavery was abolished, many African Americans continued to seek turpentine work for the low wages that it did actually pay them. Eventually, this led to the destruction of the forest, and the industry, as I mentioned, kept trooping further and further south and into Florida in the early 1900s. And then here in Central Florida, in the Sarasota area, it reached our area in the 1930s. Between 1910 and 1925, U.S. naval stores produced 18 to 36 million gallons of turpentine. And depending on the research that you look at, somewhere between 600 and 1,200 million pounds of rosin, both valued at millions of dollars. So it really was quite a big industry, a very important economic driver, especially here in the Southeast. And then pine tar or pitch was predominantly used for the sealing and coating of those wooden ships. It was also used for protecting ropes and sails. So that pine tar or pitch is what you got from burning the stumps sort of in this underground pit. And that was called slow burning the pine. And then later, when those stills were used, they processed the oleo resin, which is what you get from the trees. So right here on the previous slide, this gentleman here is collecting the oleo resin in what we call a hurdy cup. The pine tree has been slashed, and we'll talk more about this process in a second. And then there are gutters that are placed into the tree that allow the oleo resin to run down into the hurdy cup. This is collected, and then it is put in a barrel on a wagon and taken back to the still in order to be distilled. And when you distill the oleoresin, your products are going to be rosin, which is more of a solid. If any of you have played the violin or the viola or the cello, you've used rosin on your bow, and that is that same product. And then the liquid product is turpentine. Rosin and turpentine were and still are used in a variety of products, such as adhesives, sealants, inks, paints, varnishes, even things like cleansers. Think about Pine Sol, which was originally utilizing some of these products, now maybe utilizing more of a chemical derived fragrance. But originally, before we had chemical fragrances, we used these products as to get that pine fragrance as well as in flavorings for food. Currently, most rosin is extracted from a paper making process, and it is referred to as tall oil instead of distillation or burning. And then, of course, many of you are familiar with amber, which is actually the fossilized oleo resin from extinct conifers. And it also or often has insects inside the fossilized amber because, of course, that oleo resin before it became fossilized was very, very sticky and would entrap insects within it. All right, so we're going to jump into the process. So here are a few current day pictures of historic cat face trees. This one on your left is from that research forest up in Gainesville, the Austin Carey Forest. This one, I'm not sure, I can't guarantee you that that is really historic. I think that was done more recently as an example. You'll also are going to see many pictures from Austin Carey Forest of their still that they built as a historic replica. So this was near that replica still. And you can see that the bark is cut into, and we call this a cat face because it will end up looking like the whiskers on a cat. And of course, with that damage to the tree then basically bleeds this oleo resin, which is captured by the gutters and brought down into the hurdy cup. And then workers would come, as I mentioned, and collect the hurdy cups every 1 to 2 weeks usually, and then scoop all of that out into a bigger barrel, put it on a wagon that was then transported back to where the still was located. Here, this is a historic cat face tree. This one is at Osprey Junction Trailhead, which is a trailhead for the Legacy Trail here in Sarasota County. And you can go there and look around and see if you can find this tree. There's a couple of them there. And also when you're out in some of our county's natural areas, if you're in a pine flatwood area, keep your eyes open because if you see something like this, then you are looking at about 100 years of Sarasota County history right there, if not more. Here are some of the tools that were used to start this process with the cat facing of the pine tree and the collection of the oleo resin. So you'll see lots of different things here. This is Let's see, the maul is basically like a big hammer that's used to pound the gutter axe into the tree so that you can then place the metal gutters to collect and drip that resin into the hurdy pot. You could sometimes scrape the tree to either get the majority of that resin off when you go to collect it or to actually damage the tree a little bit more. Let's see. The box dip paddle was used to dip the oleo resin out of a box, which is what they used to use before the hurdy cup was invented. And then you'd scoop all of that oleo resin out and then transport it back to the still. Let's see what else. This helps to the pull up yo-yo, helps to scrape the hardened gum from the cat face. And then the turpentine puller was used to cut away the bark initially to create the cat face. So those are just some of the tools. And here you see some historic photos of people actually utilizing the tools. This is It says chipping a tree to make turpentine, but what he's really doing here is pulling. And you can see that he's covered over the hurdy pot so that nothing falls in while he's sort of cleaning up this cat face. And then he will take this off so that it can continue uh, to drip oleo resin into that hurdy cup. Here's a hack, which was another tool that's used to create the cat face. Here's one of the boxes that they use prior to utilizing that hurdy cup to collect the oleo resin. And you can see this is just starting out creating the cat face, and they've put in the gutters to collect the oleo resin into the box. And you see some of these tools that we just talked about here. Here's a hack to create the cat face, a gutter axe to make the cuts to put the metal gutters in, and that maul that really helps to pound all that stuff into the tree. Here's another example of a hack and the starting of a cat face. Here's a cat face that's a little further along. Here are some example hurdy pots. So these have a really interesting history, I think. For any of you that are fans of the Georgia Bulldogs, you'll find this interesting as well. So Charles Holmes Hurdy, who was alive from 1867 to 1938, was a chemist and professor at UGA, the University of Georgia. And he invented the Hurdy cup in 1902. And he also, fun fact, founded UGA's first baseball and football teams. And I think he was very instrumental in also building the first football stadium. So, sort of interesting history in agriculture. But you can see there's a lot of variety to them. These are more your traditional hurdy cups that he would have invented, but then there are also some other types of pots that were used throughout time to collect that oleo resin as well. And you can see on this one here, you can see that the hurdy pots were made with this hole so that they were easy to attach to the base of the pine tree. So you could start your cat face higher up, and then as you needed to, you could continue to score the pine tree and move that hurdy cup lower and lower until you got all the way down to the ground, which was a little bit more efficient use of the overall pine tree. Of course, these things often caused a lot of damage to the pine trees as well. Here are some of the aluminum and metal and a couple other pottery and glass vessels that were also used historically to collect that oleo resin. And then here's a historic photo from, I think, Dixie County around 1930, where you just basically see a whole pine flatwood forest that the majority of the trees have the cat faces scored into them. And you're seeing some of these collection containers here. Another photo. It's more circa 1900, so probably a little bit further north in Florida. Here are some of the vessels that were used to transport either the oleo resin from the site of collection at the pine trees, or were then utilized to store the rosin and or the turpentine after those products were distilled from the oleo resin. Here are some of the barrel making tools that would have been used to make those wooden barrels, put the metal around them to hold them together, and also to make and install the lids upon the barrels. This is another example of something used for barrel making. So this looks like they're making the top or bottom of the barrels on this piece of equipment. Here's another piece of equipment used for barrel making. I just think it's really fascinating to see these things. It's really nice to see the color photos, which of course all the color photos are from the replica still at the University of Florida's Austin Carey Research Forest, where they have the replica still, and then they have all of these other pieces of equipment. But it's really fun to see the historic photos from the early 1900s of people actually in action, really doing these things. And here you can see for this particular still, the owner was lucky enough to have a car. Generally, they were doing a lot of the transportation with wagons, but sometimes the owner either showed up in his car or there was a car available to help with transportation. This is a Hoover wagon. So they would piece together these wagons in order to be able to get them out into the uneven ground of the pine flatwoods. Often the regular wagon wheels would not work well in those conditions. And so often they would take old tires off of cars or trucks and put them on the wagons. And this wagon was set up to be pulled by either oxen or horses or mules. And so, depending on the still, you might have all different methods of transportation to not only get out into the pine flatwoods, but also to then bring the oleo resin in these barrels back to the still. So a few pictures of this as well. So here, this is the oleo resin, which they sometimes called gum. So this is in its raw form. So you can see that often it has a lot of other things in it, pine needles, bark chips, things like that. So they are testing that before they remove it from the wagon and will then put it into the whole distillation process. And here we have some mules hauling the barrels. So here we have a sort of overall picture of the replica still up in the Austin Carey Forest. So this is the platform where the wagons would drive up to unload the barrels. The barrels would then be rolled up this area here so that and of course these barrels are very heavy, so they can get into the still up here. And we're going to walk through that whole process together right now. This is the firebox underneath that platform that you just saw. This is actually the still area right here. So of course they're going to be filling up the firebox with wood. They're going to be stoking that and getting it nice and warm in order to heat the still. There's a photo from circa 1930. Here's just that same, it's the replica still, and it's just looking from up top on the platform down to the platform where the wagons would pull up and unload the barrels. They would roll these barrels up here in order to empty them into the still. So they're going to empty all of that sticky, heavy oleo resin right here. You can barely see at the bottom of this picture. There's sort of a door into, sort of like a trap door into the still. And this is the still underneath this platform. Okay. This still would normally be surrounded by an entire brick room, which as the fire heats up, it will heat up the air in the room around the still. So they didn't put the fire under the still because that caused a lot of other problems, such as uneven heating, but also this whole process was very flammable. And you had to make sure that you did everything right, that it didn't get too hot, that the products in the still didn't boil too much. They actually had a person at the stills that was called a sounder. And that person's job was simply to know the sounds of that the still makes before it gets too hot so they could help them manage the heat so the whole thing didn't blow up. It's pretty amazing to think about. All right, so back to our process. So the oleo resin gets dumped in here, which then means it would end up here in the still. Here you see that happening, dumping the oleo resin into the still. Look at that stuff. Crazy. All the steam coming out. Here's the same type of still that you just saw in the color photo. And here's a bricklayer that is finishing up that brick box around this, oops, sorry, around the still so that it wouldn't be heated directly with fire. This is all the stuff I just mentioned. And then as the oleo resin heats up and creates steam, it's that steam we want to distill to get the final products. So, or at least the turpentine. So the steam would come up. I'm going to show you this picture again. Go all the way back to here. So then the steam is coming up from the still into this apparatus. It's going over here to this big vat that is going to have the cooling coil. And you sort of see the exact same apparatus right here. And then the cooling or condenser coil is called the worm. So you guys excited to see the worm? I sort of showed it to you for a second. Show you the worm in a second. But 50-gallon barrels of raw gum, of the raw oleo resin, would yield about 11 gallons of turpentine and somewhere around 330, 340 pounds of rosin. So those barrels are about 50 gallons each, and you're going to have to just keep this process going to create as much turpentine and rosin that was needed back in the early 1900s. And there it is, the worm. So that's our condenser coil. This wooden vat would be filled with about 5,000 to 6,000 gallons of water that would be pumped into it or transported and dumped into it from a nearby river. So you wanted these to be pretty close to a water source because that's a lot of water. And then the steam from the still is now being driven into this condenser coil, and it will condense inside that coil into a liquid. And then, so here's the outside of that wooden vat. Here is the end of the worm or the condenser coil. And as the steam is condensing into a liquid, it's then going to drip out of this end here into barrels. Okay. And then it naturally separates because that condensed steam, which is now a liquid, is going to be part water and then part turpentine. And the turpentine separates and rises to the top. And then this right here is a little valve that allows them to drain the water off so that eventually the entire barrel is filled with just turpentine. And there's just another view of it from the side. And you can see there's the still right there. It's not currently connected. And of course, it doesn't have its brick box built around it so that you can see it. But there's the still. The oleo resin got dumped in from the platform up here. Here you can see the line that's going to take the steam into the condenser coil or worm here in our vat filled with water. And then the liquid products, the water and the turpentine, are going to drip out here. And then there's going to be a bunch of stuff left in the bottom of the still, and that's going to be rosin. So the rosin would then get scooped out from the bottom of the still, once it had cooled, of course, and it gets placed in here to be strained because it's still going to have a lot of those pine needles and bark chips and dirt and insects and whatever else happened to be in that oleo resin when it was collected out in the field. So there's usually a 3-method straining procedure. So here you can see it would go in here, it would get a rough strain into here and further fine straining. Usually there would be like a cotton cloth that would be laid in the strainer as well that would really provide that last fine strain of the rosin. And then that rosin is collected and put into barrels as well. Here's another historic photo. So here you can see the still surrounded by the brick and them collecting the rosin from the bottom of the still for straining. And then it goes into this barrel. Here we have a convict, and you might want to know why we have a convict, and I will tell you that soon. But we have a convict hauling distilled turpentine in those barrels to, in this case, a river outside of Alva, Florida, for shipping. Although a lot of our turpentine industry products were actually transported via railway to the local ports to then be transported across to Britain. Here you can see them actually weighing rosin barrels at a transport facility. So look at all of those barrels that are there. This was really a huge industry. Here's a turpentine and rosin plant and its storage yard, circa 1920 up in Pensacola. Here's one in Nassau County, Florida, circa 1900. Just look again at all those barrels of product. And then here's a steamboat that is loading turpentine and possibly rosin as well at a landing on the Ocklawaha River up in Putnam County, and that's circa 1909. So both methods, both river transport and railway transport, were utilized, but the railway really brought a lot of people here to Florida. It also transported a lot of products from both the turpentine industry and the timbering industry to either other areas in our country or out to Great Britain. All right, so we're going to bring this home with talking about the people of the turpentining industry, which is, for me, as I mentioned at the beginning, was a very eye-opening educational process to learn about this in terms of the people who made this all happen. And it's a very sort of sad, perhaps not happy part of our history as well. But the turpentine industry did provide a source of labor for people who might not have had it. It was a very dangerous industry. It was a very hard industry, and it was a very low paying industry. And it was eventually reformed, and then eventually, due to some history that we'll talk about, no longer is as necessary in our country. So certainly isn't as much of a focus of our economy here in the South, for better or worse. All right, so we'll start out with a few photos of some of the owners of the turpentine camps and stills. Of course, here you're seeing white folk. So this is circa 1920. You're mostly going to see white folk as owners and usually as what we call the woods riders, which were the foremans that managed the camps and the process out in the pine flatwoods. And then the owners just reap the benefits. Here is Sinclair's still that was constructed in 1936. Here is the Cooper's Shed at the Naval Stores Research Station in Olustee, Florida. And this was 1932. The Cooper Shed is where the barrels are made. So a cooper is the person who makes barrels. And often this is called the cooperage or the Cooper Shed. So turpentining was hard on the forest and it was hard on humans. Turpentining often weakened the trees, as you can only imagine, because it's opening up their bark to diseases and opening up the overall structure of the tree to weakness and also potentially to pests like beetles that bore through the tree. And so on your right-hand side is a picture of um, let's see, this was a hurricane in September of 1935. And so this is actually, I believe, a much larger picture that I just put an insert of because it just showed all of these trees that basically broke at the cap face when the high winds of the hurricane went through the forest. Um, on your left-hand side of the screen, this is one of the stills that exploded when things didn't go right. And of course, all of those products are highly flammable. So as soon as you had a fire, you often lost your still, your product, and sometimes human life as well. So this fire occurred in 1957, sort of a late distillery there. 97% is, I believe we mentioned this right at the beginning, approximately 97% of our longleaf pine ecosystem in the southeast coastal plain was lost to this industry, as well as the timbering industry, and also the south or the longleaf pine ecosystem is a fire maintained ecosystem. So I mentioned the words fire suppression earlier. When you do not allow either natural fires set by lightning or prescribed fires set by trained park rangers and land managers to occur in longleaf forests, they will succeed to a different type of ecosystem. So development, turpentining, timbering, and fire suppression were all causes of this devastating loss of this incredibly biodiverse ecosystem. We can replant these ecosystems, but they're never the same as naturally occurring forests. Better than nothing, but they're never the same as what would have been there naturally. And as I mentioned earlier as well, often these forests have not been replanted with longleaf pine, but other pine species. So here are some pictures of some of the laborers and family members at the Turpentine camp. So laborers were usually male, although often their whole family was there with them. The females sometimes worked in the commissary or in the school or helped provide childcare. So camps were usually remote. They were near the work site out in the woods. So often these families had a very harsh existence with not very many amenities. They were, these camps were usually considered temporary, so houses were not often well constructed because when they utilized all of the pine flatwoods in an area that they could reach from the camp, they would then shut the camp down and try to move somewhere else or just shut it down completely. So often these camps had a decade, maybe two lifespan, and then they were no longer going to be useful. So the camps would often have other buildings and things there that would provide for the necessities of life, not really amenities of life or luxuries by any means, but necessities. So sometimes there was a school or a church. There usually was a commissary that was owned by the Turpentine camp owner. There was, of course, the cooper shed where the barrels were made, a casket maker, and a cemetery, because as we mentioned, this is very hard on not only the pines, but the people as well. And so there was a pretty decent rate of death in some of these turpentine camps. Here's some more pictures of the people. I think this is as important as talking about the pine ecosystems first, because the pine ecosystems are our natural history, but this is our social history. These are the people that made this industry work. And often it provided them a livelihood, but it was a pretty harsh livelihood in many situations. Some camps were better than others and weren't so harsh or were well managed and people were well treated. But there are many, many stories of situations where treatment was not good and in many cases just downright dehumanizing, in my opinion. So I think it's really important to see these people and who they were. Here's a cabin where turpentine workers might have lived. So often just a one-room wooden cabin. Here, this is entitled Wash Day at Lewis Plantation and Turpentine still up in Brooksville. So once again, like one room cabin where a family would live, maybe even multiple families and doing their wash outside. So a little bit about the turpentine camps actually here in Sarasota. So there's not a ton of recorded information about this. So I'm sharing what I was able to find. There is some decent information on a couple of the camps. And then we also know, for instance, we know there was a turpentine camp where Carlton Reserve is now located, but we don't really have much information or a written history about it. And there are a few others. There was one, I believe, down in like the Lemon Bay area. So we had more than just the ones I'm going to talk about. These are just the ones that we know a little bit of written history about. So as I mentioned, many small towns along railroads in Florida were created because of the lumber and turpentine industries, which were very important economic industries for Florida post-Civil War. So we had a Sidell turpentine camp in eastern Sarasota County. It had about 30 to 40 shanty homes in 1934 for workers and their families. Between every house, there was a faucet attached to a well, and there was a commissary for most necessities, and a church and schoolhouse for the kids. So that's what we know about Sidell Turpentine Camp. There was also a turpentine camp along where Bee Ridge Road is located now. This one was owned and run by Berryman Thomas or B.T. Longino Sr. His children are still ranchers here in our agricultural community, children and maybe grandchildren, and Luke Grubbs, who worked for him. They opened the Bee Ridge Turpentine Camp in 1937 near the Clark Road, Bee Ridge Road area, where the Seaboard Airline Railway track went through. So that railway track is what we now have as the Legacy Trail. So if you've driven on Clark and Bee Ridge Road, actually on both of those roads, our Sarasota County Parks is now building overpasses for the Legacy Trail. So somewhere in that area is where the historic Turpentine Camp had been. And they collected the oleo resin for both Sidell and Bee Ridge camps, all the way from Osprey to Fruitville on company-owned or leased land. And this is just a picture, a historic picture of the Seaboard Airline Railway track. And if you want to learn more about that history, I have more information about that in my Legacy Trail story map, which I can tell you how to get to at the end of the presentation. Albert Jones was a African American or Black woods rider who supervised the Sidell and Bee Ridge camp. T.W. Myers, we know, was another Black woods rider. So these were like the foremans that went out into the woods and supervised the laborers, as you see there. The woods rider is on a horse. So they basically had nearly absolute power over the workers. They did the bidding and fulfilled the desires of the owners of the camp to make sure that the camp was being productive. This is a historic photo of the Laurel Blackburn quarters. These were camps set up sort of basically about at Laurel Road and 41, where that intersection is now. And they were called quarters because there were actually 4 different camps on either corner of the intersection that were one was for Turpentine Camp, one was for a lumber operation. And I can't remember what the other ones were for off the top of my head, but each of the quarters housed families and workers for a specific industry, which is sort of interesting. Here are the actual homes that were there. So once again, you're seeing like a 1-room cabin, maybe a 2-room building because there's 2 doors there, but the family rooms inside probably would have been a single room. And this is where many of those workers in the industries in the early to mid 1900s would have lived. This is the Johnson Chapel, which is a historic chapel. It's actually the only, oh, let me see if I can get this right. The only known It's either the only known historic building, I could be wrong with that, might be the only known historic church that served African Americans in the early 1900s here in Sarasota County that is still in existence. So it's been moved. It was actually moved early on. It was originally built by Bertha Palmer, I believe, for a Baptist congregation, and then it was moved and served an African American congregation from those Laurel quarters. And then it has now been moved to a different part of Laurel and is still in existence. Here is a picture from some other area in the state of quarters for turpentine workers. Those houses look a little bit nicer. And this was circa 1930. All right, so some of the hard aspects, as if we haven't talked about enough of them already. So the pay for turpentine camp laborers in Florida in the 1930s ranged from $10 to $25 a month for an adult male. Woods riders got $30 plus a share of firewood. And then, of course, housing was provided because you just saw the houses that were provided. Our laborers worked from cant to cant. So that is from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. So you got $10 to $25 a month for doing harsh, hard manual labor from sunrise to sundown. Often our laborers were paid monthly in company script that could only be used at the company commissary. So this created a cycle of poverty, something we call debt peonage, where basically they didn't have money they could save for themselves or money that they could even do what they really wanted with outside of the turpentine camp. They could only spend their wages in company script at the company commissary, which often charged really ridiculous prices for things that they needed, like flour or eggs or things like that, or clothing. And they often weren't even told exactly how much anything cost. They were put on credit and they were allowed to purchase on credit, but then they weren't allowed to ever leave the camp until they paid off their debt to the commissary. So this basically kept them as indentured servants to the turpentine camps. Not every turpentine camp did it that way, but many of them did. Here's an example of a naval stores commissary circa 1900. So you can see the windows are barred. You certainly don't want your laborers breaking in there to get any necessary items without paying for them. I just thought this was an interesting historic photo of laborers gambling for Camel cigarettes on payday. So once again, just trying to not only find some enjoyment, but also find some ways to get the things that they want if they don't have enough money to get them from the commissary. All right, let's go to the convict leasing system. We're getting near the end, so if you just hang in there with me for a few more minutes, we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers, hopefully answers. So the convict leasing program started in 1877, and it met the need for manual labor in a number of industries throughout the South. So Florida was not the only one that did this, but Florida, I believe, did it for the longest. So convicts replaced the work slaves would have done prior to the Reconstruction area. And in Florida, this convict leasing system lasted well into the 1920s. Convicts were seen as disposable. So I have heard historians say that as absolutely horrendous as slavery was, in some ways this was even more dehumanizing because these people were not even considered property. So they would just be replaced free of cost if they died. So there was really hardly any incentive for the turpentine camp owners and foremen to keep these people healthy. Because if they died, there were just more convicts and the state would just send another convict. It cost them $20 a month usually to lease a convict from the state. So both the brokers and state profited, and the private companies, the turpentine companies, and these other industries had a reliable, replaceable labor force. Here's another picture. So we see in these pictures that we have both white and black convicts in this labor system. And here you see these are the oleo resin buckets that they're using the dip paddles to collect the oleo resin into that will then go into these barrels to be transported back to the still. All right, so this is from our state archives, and this is from the Lemon Bay Turpentine Company. And they were required, all of the companies that used convicts as labor were required to keep a history of any punishment of the convicts. So you can see the examples here, name of the prisoner, the date they were punished. Oh, they had a number too. What they were punished for. So see, a lot of them were just punished for bad work or sassing. Here, somebody actually escaped. A whole bunch of people were punished for laziness. Okay. And then lacerated. So they would get whipped. That was the most common form of punishment. So this is the number of times they were whipped and whether or not they were actually lacerated by the whipping, which usually in the records I saw no, although here for this gentleman that escaped, 15 licks, which was a pretty high punishment. And yes, they were lacerated. Then the whipper had to sign his name, and whoever recommended the whipping also had to sign their name and any other notes. So really, really unpleasant part of our history, in my opinion. I also found some records that indicated doctors' visits. So they would bring doctors out to the turpentine camps to assess the health of the convict laborers. And that sounds like it was a great idea and humane, but really what they were assessing was the amount of work these sick convicts could do. So as these laborers got more and more run down or got ill because they were being whipped and then they were getting infections or illnesses, the doctors would assess their condition and then give them a fraction. So you might get a fraction of a quarter or a third or two-thirds. And that fraction indicated the amount of labor you could do compared to a totally healthy laborer, so that they would have records of who was healthy, who wasn't, how much labor that each person could do, and whether or not they were keeping up with their 25% ability to do labor or not. So quickly, we're going to talk about the end of the convict leasing system here in Florida. So this young gentleman, Martin Tabert, he was 22 years old. He was a North Dakota resident, and he decided he had been taking care of his farm for his family. And then his brothers came to help take care of the farm in North Dakota, and he decided he wanted to see a little bit more of the world. So he was traveling around the country by train, and he ran out of money. So he was arrested down here in Florida for riding a train without a ticket, and he was put in jail in Leon County for vagrancy in 1921. He was ordered by the court to pay $25 or be sentenced to 3 months hard labor. So he communicated with his family. His family in North Dakota sent, I think they actually sent $750. So far more than the actual $25 of his fine and enough to cover his release plus his ticket home. But there's this whole sordid history about how the sheriff returned it in Leon County back to the family because Martin had already been taken from the Leon County jail and put into a turpentine camp, and so they couldn't find him. So he was leased to the Putnam Lumber Company and I'm sorry, he was actually leased to a lumber company, but he was leased for that $20 a month. He became horrendously ill and was whipped over 50 times because he wasn't able to work. And he died from his illness and injuries the next day. Both the sheriff and judge were asked to resign. This became a huge thing because here's this young white gentleman from a good family with means that they have lost their son to this horrendous circumstance in Florida. So they made a big deal of it, as well they should have. And this, I believe, went all the way to the New York Times. So there was a lot of press about this, and it really brought a lot of focus on the practice of convict leasing here in Florida. So the sheriff and judge were asked to resign. I don't believe they did. The physician was recommended to be removed from practicing. Not sure what happened with the physician. And the whipping boss of the lumber company was arrested, put on trial, was found guilty, and then later released from jail. So basically, I don't really see that there were any repercussions for this incident. But what it did, and I'm sorry, before I go there, what it did do is it did basically put a fisheye onto this practice here in Florida, where many other states had already discontinued the use of convict labor leasing. Really, here in Florida, this was, luckily, in my opinion, the downfall of the convict leasing system here. And then the overall turpentine industry just continued to decline after losing that labor source, but more so because of many of these other things that changed in the 1940s and 1960s after being a preeminent economic driver for over 300 years for the Southern economy. So in the 1940s and 60s, we weren't making wooden ships after World War II. We had a decreased need for these naval stores. We had stockpiles of them that we had been stockpiling since the 1930s. We had harvested the raw material, so there just weren't that many pines left to harvest anyways. We had a shortage of workers. For example, there were 3,300 recorded turpentine workers in Florida by the 1960s compared to 21,000 in the 1950s. And then, of course, we had innovations in chemistry that led to chemical products being created that replaced many of our raw pine products. And we had that competing tall oil industry that replaced the production of rosin with it being produced by paper pulp, which was already and still is being produced. So you could get two products from one process. So our last slide here, to try to end it on a happy note, there are restoration efforts ongoing to restore longleaf pine ecosystems with our recognition of how important they are to biodiversity and how important biodiversity is overall to our world and even specifically to human health. So there is an alliance called the Longleaf Alliance. And that is a founding member of America's Longleaf Pine Restoration Initiative. If you want to learn more, I would Google those. And they are a collaborative effort of multiple public and private sector partners that actively support these range-wide efforts to restore and conserve longleaf pine ecosystems. In 2010, NRCS has worked with Longleaf Pine Initiative to restore longleaf pine forests on more than 870,000 acres on private lands. And the Nature Conservancy works to restore and manage longleaf pine forests from Texas to Virginia. So today, there are just 5.2 million acres of longleaf pine ecosystems, but this is up from a historic low of 3.2 million acres 2 decades ago. So we are making progress, and they are absolutely beautiful ecosystems to be able to visit, and hopefully we will continue to see these restoration efforts increase these ecosystems throughout the Southeast coastal plain. So I want to thank you all for joining me. I am a little over time. Sorry, there's just so much information to include in this presentation. Thank you for staying on if you're still with us.